As a kid, I loved visiting my grandparents' old Victorian-style house. But one summer evening when I was about 10 years old, something strange and terrifying happened that I will never forget. It was a hot and humid night, and my grandparents had set up a guest room for me to sleep in. The room was at the end of a long hallway, and as I walked towards it, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. As I entered the guest room, I was struck by a sense of unease. The room was cold despite the heat outside, and the air seemed to be thick with an otherworldly presence. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but as I got into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I closed my eyes and tried to ignore it, but that's when I heard it. It was a faint whisper, too quiet to make out what it was saying. At first, I thought it was just the wind outside, but as the whispering grew louder, I knew it was something else entirely. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I saw her. Standing at the foot of my bed was a woman in a flowing white gown. She had long dark hair and a sad, wistful expression on her face, but her eyes were what terrified me the most. They were hollow, black pits that seemed to suck in all the light around them. She looked like a ghostly apparition, and I knew in my bones that she wasn't human. I was frozen in terror as she floated towards me, her gown billowing out behind her. She hovered over me, and I could feel her icy breath on my face. That's when she spoke. Her voice was a low, rasping whisper that seemed to come from another world. "Do not be afraid," she said. "I am the ghost of the woman who lived in this room before you. I have been trapped here for centuries, waiting for someone to help me." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was trapped, alone in the dark with this terrifying spirit. The ghostly figure continued, "I was murdered in this room, and my killer was never caught. I need you to help me find my killer so that I can finally rest in peace." I was too scared to speak, so I just nodded, hoping that she would leave me alone. But she didn't. Instead, she began to recount the gruesome details of her murder. She told me about the night her killer broke into her room, how he strangled her and left her body in the bed. She described the pain and fear she felt as she took her last breaths. As she spoke, the room grew colder and darker. The air was thick with the stench of death, and I could feel a sense of evil closing in around me. I tried to shut my eyes and block out the ghostly figure, but she wouldn't let me. She continued to speak, her voice growing louder and more desperate. That's when I saw it. The figure of her killer appeared in the room, a dark, menacing presence that made my blood run cold. He was tall and lean, with a twisted, evil expression on his face. His eyes were sunken, and his skin was the color of ash. The ghostly figure of the murdered woman began to scream, begging me to help her. I could feel the fear rising in my throat, and I knew that I had to do something. I jumped out of bed and ran towards the door, but it was locked from the outside. I pounded on the door, screaming for my grandparents to let me out, but there was no answer. I turned around, and the ghostly figure of the murdered woman was still there, hovering in the air. The figure of her killer was now standing right beside her, his twisted face inches from hers. The air was filled with sickening energy, and I could feel their rage and desperation. Then suddenly, the room was plunged into darkness. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel a cold, bony hand on my shoulder. I screamed, trying to shake it off, but it wouldn't budge. I knew at that moment that I was not alone in the room. The hand tightened its grip, and I felt a sharp pain in my chest. It felt like I was being stabbed with 1,000 needles all at once. I tried to scream, but my voice was choked off by the overwhelming sense of terror. Finally, the hand released me, and the room was filled with an eerie silence. I opened my eyes, and the ghostly figures were gone. The room was empty except for me and the sense of malevolent energy that still lingered in the air. I stumbled to the door and pounded on it again, and this time my grandparents answered. They found me in a state of shock, trembling and unable to speak. It took me weeks to recover from that experience. I never went back to my grandparents' house, and I avoided anything to do with ghosts or the supernatural. But even now, years later, I can still feel the cold, bony hand on my shoulder and the sense of malevolent energy that surrounded me that night. It's a memory that I will never forget, no matter how much I try to erase it.